Before the world lived in your pocket, before notifications buzzed and screens followed you everywhere, life had a natural pause button. In the 1980s, silence still existed. Waiting was part of the deal. If you wanted entertainment, you planned for it. If you wanted information, you searched for it. And if you missed a moment, it was simply gone. Time moved differently then. Evenings stretched longer, weekends felt earned, and boredom wasn't an enemy. It was a doorway. You stared out car windows, listened to the radio fade in and out, and let your imagination fill the gaps. There was no endless scroll to distract you, no instant replay to soften disappointment. Life happened once, in real time. The 1980s sat at a crossroads in history. The modern world was knocking, but it hadn't yet barged in. Technology was arriving slowly, awkwardly, often with wires, manuals, and loud beeping noises. It promised convenience, but it hadn't taken control. People still gathered around the same television, waited by the same phone, and shared the same experiences at the same hour. Everyday moments carried weight because they required effort. Music had to be caught at the right second. Movies had to be returned on time. Conversations required presence. When the lights went out, the day was over, not paused, not saved, not backed up to a cloud. This was the last era where life truly powered down, and whether people realized it or not, they were living through the final chapter of a fully analog world. One foot in the past, the other stepping carefully toward a future no one could yet imagine. In the 1980s, wealth wasn't measured by upgrades or excess. It was measured by stability, a steady job, a reliable car, and a home with enough space to close the door at night. For much of the middle class, that was the goal, and for many, it was within reach. The average house cost a fraction of what it would in later decades. It wasn't grand or polished, but it was solid. 3 bedrooms, a yard, maybe a second bathroom if you were lucky. Mortgage payments didn't dominate every conversation. Owning a home felt like an expectation rather than a distant dream, and that sense of permanence shaped how families planned their futures. Salaries were modest by modern standards, yet they stretched further. One income often covered the basics: food on the table, utilities paid, and a used car in the driveway. Groceries were practical, not curated. Shopping meant filling a cart with staples, not choosing between brands marketed as lifestyles. Coupons mattered, but food itself didn't feel like a luxury item. It was simply part of life. Gas prices became a quiet source of celebration. When the numbers dipped, people noticed. Long drives felt possible again, road trips returned to family plans, and commuting didn't feel like a constant financial strain. The cost of getting from place to place didn't yet dictate where you could afford to live. There was less pressure to constantly upgrade. Kitchens weren't remodeled every decade. Cars were driven until they couldn't be driven anymore. Clothes were worn, repaired, and passed down. Luxury existed, but it wasn't the baseline expectation. Most families lived within clear limits, and those limits created predictability. That simplicity carried social weight. When neighbors lived similarly, comparison faded into the background. Status wasn't defined by square footage or brand names, but by reliability: who showed up on time, who kept their word, who paid their bills. The 1980s middle-class economy wasn't perfect, and it wasn't effortless, but it offered something increasingly rare: breathing room. Enough stability to plan, enough predictability to relax, and enough security to believe that tomorrow would look much like today, and that for many families was more than enough. In the 1980s, home wasn't just where you lived. It was where life happened. Houses didn't need to be smart or stylish. They needed to work. And for most families, they did. The living room in particular served as the emotional headquarters of the household. Furniture was heavy, durable, and rarely replaced. Televisions sat inside thick wooden frames, more like furniture than electronics. They stayed in the same spot for years, sometimes decades. Families arranged their schedules around that screen because it wasn't personal. It belonged to everyone. When something aired, everyone watched together, or not at all. The details were unmistakable. Popcorn ceilings dotted nearly every room. Shag carpets softened footsteps, and wood paneling gave spaces a warm, slightly dim glow. Walls were lined with family photos, school portraits, holiday snapshots, awkward poses frozen in time. These weren't decorative choices. They were records of a shared life. Entertainment lived at home, VHS tapes stacked near the VCR, handwritten labels slowly fading. Blank cassettes waited to capture a favorite show or movie. Microwaves hummed as leftovers spun inside, signaling a quiet shift toward convenience without replacing family dinners. Tupperware-filled cabinets, mismatched lids and all, holding everything from leftovers to childhood snacks. Privacy existed, but it was limited. Bedrooms were smaller, doors thinner, and solitude wasn't assumed. That closeness shaped family rhythms. Arguments echoed, laughter carried, and silence was noticed. When the lights were off and the TV clicked silent, the day truly ended. In an era before constant connection, home was not an escape from the world. It was the world, a place where routines formed, memories layered, and ordinary nights became the moments people would later remember most clearly. Entertainment in the 1980s wasn't endless, instant, or personalized. It demanded attention, timing, and often patience. If you wanted to watch something, you showed up for it, physically and mentally. Miss it, and the moment was gone. Television followed the clock, not the viewer. Shows aired once a week at a fixed hour, and families organized evenings around that schedule. Thursday nights meant certain programs. Saturday mornings belonged to children, uninterrupted and sacred. There was no pausing, no rewinding, no catching up later unless you were lucky enough to find a rerun months down the line. That scarcity turned ordinary shows into shared national events. Movies carried similar weight. Going to the theater was an outing, not a casual decision. You checked showtimes in the newspaper, stood in line, and sat wherever seats were available. The floor was sticky, the screen enormous, and the experience unforgettable. When the lights dimmed, everyone entered the same story together. No distractions, no second screens. At home, video rentals added both freedom and pressure. You had a limited window to watch, rewind, and return a tape. Forgetting meant fees and disappointment. Entire weekends revolved around securing the right movie before someone else rented it first. That sense of urgency made even a quiet movie night feel important. Music followed the same rules. You waited for songs to come on the radio, finger poised over the record button. Timing mattered. DJs talked too much. Mistakes were permanent. A perfectly recorded song felt like an achievement, not a convenience. Even commercials mattered. Jingles stuck. Mascots became familiar faces. Ads weren't interruptions, they were part of the rhythm, especially during Saturday morning cartoons. Because entertainment was limited, it mattered more. People talked about what they watched because everyone had seen it or wished they had. In the 1980s, entertainment didn't fill the background. It commanded attention, and in return it became memory. By the 1980s, pop culture was no longer just something people consumed. It was something they wore, quoted, and lived by. Music, movies, and brands began to shape identity in visible ways, turning everyday choices into statements about who you were and where you belonged. Television and film created shared heroes almost overnight. Movie characters didn't stay on the screen. They spilled into schoolyards, fashion, and conversation. A jacket, a pair of sunglasses, or even a hairstyle could instantly signal which film had captured your imagination. These weren't subtle influences. They were bold, unmistakable, and proudly displayed. Music followed the same path. The launch of music television transformed sound into image, and suddenly artists weren't judged on talent alone. Style, attitude, and presentation mattered. Album covers, music videos, and concert shirts became badges of loyalty. Wearing a band's name across your chest wasn't just fashion, it was allegiance. Brands understood this shift and leaned into it. Sneakers became status symbols. Watches turned into personality pieces. Even soft drinks asked consumers to declare sides. Marketing stopped whispering and started shouting, embedding itself into youth culture and everyday language. What made this era unique was how permanent those choices felt. You didn't swap identities daily. You committed. Posters stayed on bedroom walls for years. T-shirts were worn until they thinned. Favorites were defended fiercely, whether it was a band, a movie, or a pair of shoes. In the 1980s, pop culture offered more than entertainment. It offered belonging. It gave people a way to recognize each other, to form tribes without saying a word. Long before profiles and bios, identity was built from what you loved, and everyone could see it. Childhood in the 1980s unfolded largely out of sight. Once the door closed behind you, the day belonged to you and the neighborhood. There were no tracking apps, no constant check-ins, and very few adults watching from a distance. Freedom wasn't earned, it was assumed. Bikes were the passport. They carried kids across blocks, parks, and sometimes entire towns, with little more than a shouted reminder to be home by dinner. Scraped knees, torn jeans, and sunburns were expected side effects, not emergencies. Risk was part of growing up, and learning limits happened through experience rather than warnings. Summer days stretched endlessly. Friends gathered wherever shade existed, taking turns at the garden hose after hours of running and climbing. Food was whatever could be found quickly, and thirst was solved with cold water straight from metal spigots. No one questioned it. Everyone survived. Public spaces belonged to kids. Arcades buzzed with noise and competition. Roller rinks glowed under spinning lights. School playgrounds became testing grounds for courage, skill, and social rank. Victory was public. Failure was temporary. Respect was earned, not awarded. School itself felt less supervised outside the classroom. Lunchrooms, hallways, and bus rides formed their own ecosystems, governed by unwritten rules. Notes were passed discreetly. Secrets traveled fast without leaving a digital trail. Embarrassment faded because it wasn't preserved. What made this freedom possible was trust between parents and communities and among neighbors themselves. Children were expected to explore, to get lost occasionally, and to find their way back. That independence shaped a generation. It built confidence through trial and error, and created memories unfiltered by adult intervention. In the 1980s, childhood wasn't managed. It was lived. Play in the 1980s was hands-on, competitive, and often unforgiving. Toys didn't guide you. Games didn't explain themselves. You learned by doing or by failing repeatedly until something finally worked. Video games were just beginning to step into homes, and they arrived without mercy. Consoles offered no tutorials, no save files, and no updates. You started from the beginning every time, and progress depended entirely on skill and patience. Cartridges were physical objects, rented for short windows, their secrets discovered through trial, word of mouth, or sheer stubbornness. Outside the house, arcades ruled. They were loud, crowded, and electric with competition. A pocketful of coins meant opportunity. High scores were public records, etched into machines for everyone to see. Beating one wasn't enough, you had to defend it. Reputation was earned 1 quarter at a time. Board games filled living rooms and kitchen tables. Some tested knowledge, others luck, but all demanded participation. Families argued over rules, challenged answers, and played long past bedtime. These games didn't entertain quietly. They filled the room with voices. Puzzles added another layer of obsession. Simple in appearance, brutal in execution. Solving one without shortcuts turned ordinary kids into legends. at least for a day. What united all of this play was engagement. You couldn't watch passively. You had to press buttons, move pieces, make choices. The 1980s quietly laid the foundation for modern interactive media, long before anyone imagined virtual worlds or online communities. Games weren't escapes yet. They were challenges, and overcoming them felt real. In the 1980s, the shopping mall was more than a place to buy things. It was a destination, a meeting ground, and for many teenagers, the first taste of independence. Climate-controlled and brightly lit, malls replaced town squares as social centers, especially in suburban life. You didn't need money to belong there. You needed presence. Friends gathered to walk, talk, and be seen, looping past the same stores again and again. Fashion mattered, but observation mattered more. Who was there, who wasn't, and who you might run into by accident. The mall made chance encounters possible. Food courts became neutral territory. Everyone could afford something small, and no one lingered too long. After eating, there were record stores to browse, arcades to compete in, and novelty shops to explore. Each stop offered a different version of entertainment, all under one roof. For parents, malls felt safe. For teens, they felt free. No schedules, no supervision hovering too close. Just time to fill and space to move through. Even boredom became social. Retail itself played a secondary role. Trying things on mattered more than buying them. Posters, music, and displays shaped taste and aspiration. The mall quietly taught young people how to navigate public life, how to gather, wait, observe, and interact. In an era before digital hangouts, malls gave communities a physical heart. They weren't just places to shop, they were places to exist together. Technology in the 1980s did not arrive all at once. It crept in, one bulky machine at a time, often confusing, sometimes intimidating, and rarely seamless. Unlike later decades, new devices didn't immediately replace old habits. They competed with them. Personal computers began appearing in offices, classrooms, and a few curious homes. They were boxy, beige, and loud, humming softly as they warmed up. Their purpose wasn't entirely clear yet. They could type documents, store simple data, and play basic games, but they demanded patience and instruction. Owning one didn't make life easier overnight, it made it different. Word processing felt revolutionary. Editing without starting over changed how people worked and learned. Printers, when available, turned typed pages into something that felt almost futuristic. Those who mastered these machines early earned quiet reputations as experts, even if no one quite knew what expertise meant yet. Television also evolved. The arrival of 24-hour news changed the rhythm of information, replacing scheduled broadcasts with constant updates. For the first time, the world felt closer and more immediate, even if most people still preferred to turn the TV off at night. Other devices filled the gaps. Answering machines spoke for households. Calculators replaced slide rules. New media formats promised better quality, even when adoption lagged behind. What defined this technological shift was restraint. Devices served specific purposes and stayed in their lanes. They didn't demand constant attention. When turned off, they truly disappeared. The 1980s introduced the tools that would shape the future, but they hadn't yet taken control of daily life. That balance made the decade unique. In the 1980s, communication required intention. You couldn't reach someone instantly, and that delay shaped how people spoke, planned, and remembered. Messages traveled at human speed, not digital speed, and everyone adjusted accordingly. Phone calls were tied to places, not people. You called a house, not a pocket. If no one answered, you tried again later. Eventually, answering machines arrived, capturing voices on tiny cassettes. Messages were short, careful, and often rehearsed. Hearing a familiar voice played back felt strangely personal. Payphones filled the gaps. They stood on street corners, inside gas stations and outside stores, scratched and dented from constant use. A handful of coins bought a few minutes of connection. Forgetting a number meant improvising or waiting. Privacy was limited, patience required, written communication carried weight. Notes were folded, passed, hidden, and sometimes destroyed to protect secrets. Address books held phone numbers, birthdays, and reminders, information stored in ink and memory rather than clouds. Losing one felt catastrophic. Navigation followed the same pattern. Maps unfolded across dashboards, creased and worn from repeated use. Getting lost wasn't a failure, it was part of the journey. Asking for directions created brief human connections, even if the advice wasn't always accurate. Because communication wasn't constant, it was valued. People listened more carefully, remembered more deliberately, and planned more thoughtfully. In the absence of instant access, presence mattered. The limitations of the era weren't obstacles, they were boundaries. And within those boundaries, relationships learned how to breathe. In the 1980s, brands didn't just sell products, they sold confidence. Advertising carried an unusual level of trust, and when companies made bold promises, the public paid attention. Marketing wasn't subtle, but it was memorable, and it shaped how people connected with everyday goods. Fast food chains, soft drink companies, and toy manufacturers became cultural forces. New products arrived with fanfare, and households adopted them quickly. Some ideas succeeded spectacularly, becoming permanent fixtures of daily life. Others failed just as publicly, sparking backlash strong enough to force companies to reverse course. Those moments revealed something rare. Consumers expected to be heard, and corporations still felt pressure to listen. Advertising leaned heavily on shared experiences. Commercials became part of family routines, especially during primetime television and Saturday morning programming. Jingles lodged themselves in memory, mascots felt familiar, and slogans entered everyday language. You didn't skip ads, you absorbed them, often without realizing it. Product loyalty formed early and lasted long. People chose sides, defended preferences, and passed them down within families. A favorite snack, a trusted brand, or a familiar logo carried emotional weight far beyond its practical use. Even small items felt personal. At the same time, innovation moved quickly. Simple inventions quietly reshaped daily habits. Notes that stuck without tape, packaging that changed convenience, products designed to save time rather than impress. These changes didn't feel disruptive, they felt helpful. What defined the era was balance. Consumers were enthusiastic but not overwhelmed. Brands competed loudly, but the marketplace still felt navigable. Choice existed without exhaustion. The 1980s created a relationship between companies and consumers built on visibility and expectation. When trust was earned, it lasted. When it was broken, people noticed and remembered. The 1980s did not believe in subtlety. Style was bold, exaggerated, and unapologetically visible. Fashion wasn't designed to blend in. It was meant to announce itself the moment you entered a room. Hair rose higher, colors grew brighter, and silhouettes expanded. Clothing borrowed freely from music, film, and fitness culture, turning everyday outfits into performances. What you wore wasn't just about comfort or trend. It was a declaration of energy, confidence, and attitude. Accessories carried just as much weight as clothing. Bright watches, layered jewelry, and oversized items signaled individuality. Even school supplies reflected this aesthetic, bursting with color and personality. Personal style followed you everywhere, from classrooms to living rooms. What made the decade distinctive was how experimental it felt. Rules were flexible. Mixing patterns, textures, and colors wasn't discouraged, it was expected. Fashion invited risk, and standing out was often the goal. Exercise culture amplified this mindset. Workout clothing spilled out of gyms and into daily wear, transforming fitness into fashion. Movement and appearance blended into a single statement of vitality. There was also joy in imperfection. Trends weren't polished or minimal. They were loud, messy, and unmistakably human. Clothes were worn hard, reused and remembered. The look of the 1980s remains instantly recognizable because it wasn't trying to be timeless. It was trying to be felt in the moment. And decades later, that confidence still echoes in memory, impossible to ignore. Not everything in the 1980s moved at the easy pace of everyday life. Certain moments cut through routine so sharply that the entire country seemed to stop and hold its breath. These events, both triumphant and tragic, became shared reference points. Memories fixed in place no matter how much time passed. Some unfolded live, watched by millions at the same instant. What began as moments of optimism or pride sometimes turned into shock and grief, leaving classrooms silent and living rooms stunned. The feeling was collective. People didn't process these events alone. They processed them together, often without the language to explain what they were seeing. Politics and global tension formed a constant backdrop. The Cold War shaped news coverage, entertainment, and even childhood fears. Speeches carried weight, not just because of policy, but because of tone and symbolism. When long-standing barriers finally fell, the impact reached far beyond borders. Even children sensed that something enormous had shifted. Popular culture amplified these moments. Films captured national moods, hope, adventure, fear, and triumph, while soundtracks lingered long after the credits rolled. Certain movies didn't just succeed, they defined eras, embedding themselves into collective memory. These moments mattered because they were unavoidable. There was no opting out, no curated feed to soften the impact. When history happened, it arrived all at once, unfiltered and shared. The 1980s taught a generation what it felt like to witness history together, to feel joy, shock, and uncertainty in real time. Those moments didn't fade quietly. They stayed, anchored in memory long after the decade ended. Beyond headlines and pop culture, life in the 1980s was shaped by repetition. Small rituals anchored the days and weeks, giving time a steady, predictable rhythm. These routines rarely felt special in the moment, yet they became the structure people leaned on without realizing it. Grocery trips happened on the same days, down the same aisles, with familiar items placed in the cart almost automatically. Meals followed patterns: simple breakfasts, packed lunches, dinners shared at the table. Food wasn't photographed or reviewed. It was eaten, talked over, and cleaned up afterward. School days moved to a dependable cadence. Morning routines, bus rides, bells, and homework all blended into a cycle that rarely changed. Evenings followed suit, television at a set hour, baths, pajamas, and lights out. Sundays slowed everything down, offering a pause before the week reset itself. Holidays and special broadcasts were marked on calendars well in advance. Missing them wasn't an option. Families gathered, popcorn was made, and traditions repeated year after year without question. These shared moments stitched generations together quietly. Yard sales, church gatherings, and weekend errands filled the spaces in between. Conversations happened face to face, often unplanned. Time wasn't optimized. It was occupied. What made these rituals powerful was their consistency. They created a sense of safety and belonging, even when life outside felt uncertain. In repeating the ordinary, people built memories without trying to. The 1980s didn't rush through its days. It moved in patterns, and those patterns stayed with people long after the decade passed. Looking back, the 1980s stand apart, not because life was perfect, but because it still had limits. The world had edges. When the day ended, it truly ended. When you left the house, you were unreachable. When a moment passed, it lived only in memory. This was the final era before constant connection rewired everyday life. Technology existed, but it waited patiently on desks and shelves. Entertainment was powerful, but it didn't follow you everywhere. Information arrived on schedules, not demand. And because access was limited, experiences carried weight. People planned more, remembered more, and talked more face to face. Mistakes faded instead of being archived. Boredom created imagination. Waiting built anticipation. Presence mattered because there were fewer distractions competing for attention. The 1980s became a bridge between two worlds. On one side stood the analog past, physical media, handwritten notes, shared rituals. On the other waited the digital future, faster, brighter, and endlessly connected. Those who lived through the decade didn't know they were standing at the threshold. They were simply living. Today, the decade lingers in memory not just as nostalgia, but as contrast. It reminds us what life felt like before everything demanded immediate response, before every moment could be recorded, edited, and replayed. The 1980s didn't disappear. They echo in habits, expectations, and the quiet longing for a slower rhythm, a time when the world still had an off switch and people remembered to use it.